Erickson highlighted four aspects of identity or areas of identity development during the stage of adolescence. He said that the adolescent will try to figure out who they are in terms of their religious affiliation, political affiliation, vocational, and sexual identity. So, when it comes to religious affiliation or identity, most adolescents will tend to follow suit with whatever their parents' religious background or religious practice is. Few of them will abandon or desert the religion as a whole. We're actually seeing a trend nowadays with, especially Generation Z, with an increase in the unaffiliated group, according to one research study. And that is that they do not reject the idea of religion as a whole, especially if they were brought up in a house that practiced the faith and they have good relationship with their parents, but they might not want to associate specifically with one religious affiliation or a category, and therefore they tend to have a belief in a superior power or a higher entity, but not necessarily have a label for it. Very few are going to be going in the opposite direction of abandoning the religion as a whole. But like we said, they do question their, the faith and certain aspects of the faith because of that cognitive development and that ability to analyze what has been taught to them. The next identity that Erickson talked about is political identity. And similarly, parents also influence their children's political identity. What we're seeing in the 21st century is that in the United States, adults are starting to identify as independent more than they are specifically as Republicans or Democrats. And in a way, their teenage children are kind of reflecting that lack of affiliation or identification. However, teenage years are very critical because at 18, those teenagers are starting to get a right that some of them view as a very important milestone in their lives. So if they grew up in a household that supported um, making a difference in society and they actually were living at home, statistics shows that they tend to exercise that right to vote more than those who might have left and are living on their own. Um, Adolescents tend to be more liberal than their parents, and this has to do with, again, that development in their brain and their limbic system and being more empathetic to social justice and the plight of other people and the injustices in our society. So they tend to be more involved in, protests and topics that really they feel passionate about or strong about because it is a matter of fairness. Related to political identity, and although not discussed by Erickson, is ethnic identity and racial identity. And even though these topics are not discussed by Erickson, in the United States, they're going to become very important, and every teenager has to kind of contend with them because we are a highly diverse society. As a matter of fact, the United States has about half of all its current adolescents identifying as one of the minority groups, either an African or Asian or a Latino or a Native American. So those categories are going to directly impact how the child was developing throughout the lifespan, what kind of feelings it or residual psychological effects it had on their upbringing. And therefore, when they reach that point where they're questioning their identity and trying to see how proud they are of their identity, chances are they will align with whatever political affiliation that kind of satisfies and boosts that identity as well. In general, statistics have shown that pride in ethnic identity correlates with academic achievement. The next identity is called vocational identity, and this is kind of what we say when we ask an adolescent, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" So, vocational identity used to mean really envisioning yourself in a particular occupation. However, as you watched in the video about role confusion and moratorium and foreclosure, very few teenagers really know what they want to do when they go to college in the first year of college or even in high school. And that is rightfully so. That is because we have become so dynamic and flexible and have so many possibilities that adolescents can choose from. As far as career. So, for them to actually know what they want when they are in high school is very, very rare. And the normal pattern would probably be that they are in a moratorium stage, not in a foreclosure where they shut down all the options or the possibilities that they can be in, or in a role of confusion where they really don't care about their future, but rather in a area where they can test certain possibilities and options and then decide on what is it that they really want to do and find their true calling. It is a myth that having a job will keep teenagers out of trouble. If you have a job, you'll become a man. What we're seeing statistically is that it's the opposite. It's actually affecting these teenagers on the long term. Part time work during high school has proven to be creating negative outcomes such as quitting school, fighting with parents, of course. Again, that uh, gaining independence and gaining the ability to make your own decisions and having money sometimes can backfire and creates that tension with the parents who's still trying to exercise their authority and do not understand what is the sensitive stage of adolescent and how they are really trying to identify themselves and make sure and make sense of who they are as an individual. And it's not really kind of a crash or a fight with the parent. They tend to smoke cigarettes, and in general, they tend to hate their job, the one they're actually having and the one that they might have later on. So typically, employed teenagers will spend that money that they get on, clothes, cars, fast food, drugs, and music, not necessarily on supporting their families, which is what would have probably been the intended goal of them having a job early on. Some of them do, but not the majority. I wanted to share this graph with you, which kind of reflects the causes for teenagers to drop out of high school. And look down there when we look at getting a job, 33.5% quit high school because they got a job. And getting a job, as you can see, males or females tended to interfere with their ambition and commitment to school. The last identity that Erickson alluded to was sexual identity. That was the original term that was given by Erickson. And he said that, we talked about how sex and sexual identity refers to the biological characteristics. However, this term got replaced with what actually Erickson meant, and that is the deciding on a person's gender identity, and that is really what a person's acceptance of the roles that are dictated by society or associated with his or her biological sex. Gender identity often begins with the person's or biological sex and should lead to a category or a role that coincides with it. However, in our society nowadays, we have seen a tremendous shift in gender role identity, a major change in what it really it means to identify with a certain gender or not to identify with a gender. So the speed and the specifics of the change vary dramatically by the culture, and as we can see, excuse me, by the cohort. We're more leaning towards fluidity now, and kind of uncertainty regarding sex and gender. And it is much more common during adolescence that we see with the rise of hormones and the fluctuation of, feelings, that it becomes really hard for a person to make that choice. And that's why keeping that kind of that door open for a person to choose their identity becomes much more easy or relaxing or less stressful on the adolescent. One of the terms that are part of our new understanding of gender identity is the term cisgender, and it refers to people whose gender identity is the same as their natural sex identity. So the fact that there is a category that has the match between the gender and the sex identity tells you a lot about the complexity of those who do not necessarily identify with either, and choose to be either trans or non-conforming in other ways.